Okay, do you have it?
Yes, Youri is recording the call.
Okay, perfect. All right. Okay. Well, welcome everyone to another episode of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. And once again, very excited for the guest we have. It's Lia Tarachansky. She is a journalist, documentary filmmaker, but is currently a PhD student at York University, and we're going to be talking all things Israel this time around. So, Ms. Tarachansky, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Youri.
Okay, so my first question is, can you explain the Israeli state which you've described as an ethnocracy?
Do you mean the term ethnocracy?
Yeah, the term ethnocracy and how that applies to Israel.
Sure. It's a term that was coined by Sandy Hilal and Oren Iftachel, who are Israeli-Palestinian scholars based in Israel. And they wrote a humongous book about the topic called Ethnocracy, which they published about a decade ago. And the book looks at Israel and other places like Japan and Estonia and other places like that are ethnocracies, meaning that they are states where the hierarchies of power are based primarily around ethnicity, and typically are cushioned inside of a form of democracy, but the democracy is really utilized in the benefit of a particular ethnic group. So Israel, for example, is an ethnocracy in the sense that it's a Jewish state. It defines itself as a Jewish state. It does not define itself as a state for all its citizens. So there are striated levels of citizenship in Israel, and also non-citizenship. So if you take all of the people that are living under the rule of the Israeli government, from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, about 50% of them are Jewish Israelis and 50% of them are Palestinians of various degrees of citizenship, non-citizenship. The vast majority, of course, live under military occupation, under martial law, without any belonging to no state as no citizens, because the Palestinian state does not exist yet. And even Palestinian citizens inside of Israel, while they are citizens, if they live in Israel proper, but not in East Jerusalem, which is a resident, but not a citizen, that even as citizens, if they are not Jewish, there's a whole plethora of laws that explicitly discriminate against them, and much more laws that implicitly discriminate against them. So Israel's democratic structures are really reserved for the ethnic group, the Jewish Israelis, that the state defines itself as serving. And so that is why the term ethnocracy is particularly applicable here. And once you start to understand this kind of political structures as something that came out of nationalism, and once you start to understand other states that are like that, like I said, for example, Japan, you can move to Japan, you can marry a Japanese person, but you will never become Japanese. You can move to Israel, you can marry an Israeli Jew, but you will never become a Jewish Israeli. Even if at some point you'll be naturalized, and you will get permanent residency, you cannot become. So that's one of the big differences between Israel as an ethnocracy and a state like Belgium that defines itself as a state of all of its citizens.
And that's really interesting. But if so, say say I move to Israel, have a job, and I marry an Israeli. But if I convert to Judaism, would I then be considered an Israeli state or still not?
If you convert to Judaism, which is going to be quite difficult in Israel, yes, then you technically, yes, you will become a citizen of the highest kind, yes. But It's a process.
But what are the difficulties that face someone if they wanted to, yeah, convert to Judaism to become an Israeli citizen?
Are you considering it?
Oh no, not me. I'm just I'm just curious because it kind of well, yeah, because it kind of leads to this question. I don't know how much you want to make a leap. Okay, because all of the African immigrants, which you've covered, the African refugees, those who are not like Ethiopian Jews or anything like that, those who are just people fleeing warfare in Sudan or fleeing persecution in Rwanda, and they're in these sort of these awful sort of tent-like communities, kind of like in Fortress Europe with the with the Syrian refugees and so forth. I mean, if they were to convert to Judaism, like would they then be sort of welcomed with open arms in Israel, or not at all?
Well, the African asylum seekers that came to Israel when the border between Egypt and Israel was still open, they came from a predominantly Christian country, Eritrea, and a predominantly Muslim country, Sudan. And there's other African refugees from other places, but those are the two main groups, Sudanese and Eritreans. They came to Israel because the border was open. There was not a lot of options for them at the time. This was largely motivated by Egypt's own very racist practices towards them, as well as the Libyan civil war. And when they came to Israel, for refugees like those coming from Sudan, they were entering an enemy state. They grew up in a country that is at war technically with Israel. And just like we in Israel here and are educated that Sudan is an enemy state, they are educated that we are an enemy state. So it must have been a very traumatic experience. They were not welcome in Israel to stay because in Israel, there is no process for immigration. There's no process for them to apply to become refugees. So because Israel is an ethnocracy, you cannot just immigrate to Israel the way that a person can immigrate to Belgium. Or immigrate to the United States. There's no process for immigration unless you are Jewish. So if you are Jewish, when you apply to become a citizen of Israel, there's a series of things that you go through, and your Jewishness is tested, and it's a whole other mafia, disgusting process. But the African asylum seekers have been asking for asylum as refugees because Israel is a signatory, and in fact was one of the main motivators for the UN Human Rights Convention on the UN Convention on the Rights of the Refugees that was enshrined in law in 1951 and was largely lobbied for by Jewish and Israeli officials because of the massive numbers of Jewish refugees after the Holocaust. As I'm sure you remember, Europe was not very keen to take these people and had to be forced to take these people back. So these millions of Jews that survived the Holocaust needed some protection. And now we live in a world where millions of African asylum seekers need protection. And Israel is technically a signatory to that convention, but did not have a process for them to apply. And so there was many years of all kinds of nonsensical bureaucratic nightmare where the government would say, well, we would accept these asylum seekers as we promised that we would under the UN Rights of the Refugee Convention, but we don't have a process to accept refugees. So if we had a process, we would accept them, but we don't have a process. So then the UNHCR stepped up and they said, well, we have a process, so we're going to start the process. And then the Israeli government, the right-wing government was elected, and they said, well, we don't want the UNHCR involved in our internal affairs. And all this stuff happened that we covered in a film that I made for Telesur called Ethnocracy, Israel's African Refugees.
Very good documentary, by the way. I definitely recommend people to check it out.
Thank you very much. It was a devastating documentary to make, and it culminated in the construction of the largest prison for African asylum seekers in the developed world. and many thousands and thousands of African asylum seekers wasting crucial years of their life in an open air prison, which was, you know, in the middle of nowhere in the desert with very few amenities, very little food, really subpar conditions, until the Supreme Court had to be appealed to 3 times, and 3 separate times ruled that the prison was unconstitutional before it was finally shut down. And now in the process, you know, thousands were deported, all kinds of things happen, and now we are left with a very, very tiny, tiny, tiny population of asylum seekers in Israel. Could they become citizens of Israel if they just all converted en masse? It's a question that's been floated around a lot, but I don't know if you realize how enormous a process it is to become a Jewish person. It's not just like, you know, reciting some words or accepting Jesus into your heart. You know, the Israeli state, besides being a state for a Jewish state, it's also a state that doesn't have real separation between religion and government. And so, for example, in Israel, it's impossible to have a secular birth, a secular death, a secular marriage. All those ceremonies, burial, they all have to be done through the religious authority, which is the chief rabbinate, which is a Eurocentric body that has its own many, many racist issues. And if you manage to get them to recognize the conversion, which would take years, because of course, first of all, you have to get a rabbi or a set of rabbis to agree to be part of your process. You have to live Jewishly. You have to live integrated in Jewish community for at least a year. You have to study Jewish texts. You have to study the 1,000-year-old civilization that is Jewishness before you accept Jewishness into your heart, into your life, and really convert. And even then, there's, you know, these people come from Africa, but they would have to be converted into a European kind of Judaism because of this racist system that the state created. Whereas African Jews, such as Jewish people from Ethiopia, or Jewish people from North Africa, like Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, Jews from Yemen, they are part of different kinds of Jewishnesses that do not belong to Europe. And they experience a lot of racism in Israel, of course. But those African asylum seekers who are not Jewish would not be able to be recognized by the state if they converted to a Sephardic or Mizrahi way of Jewishness. So there's many, many problems on top of all of that. But theoretically speaking, if every single asylum seeker was to go through that process and decide to become a Jewish person, which is accepting onto themselves not just religious identity, which, by the way, many Jewish people don't see Judaism as a religion. They see it as a way of life. So that's a whole other debate. But if they were to accept that, it would be perceived also as accepting a new nationality, as accepting a new, you know, ethnic identity. It's a huge process. And if they were to en masse go through that process, then technically, yes, they could apply for Aliyah. And then the state would have to go through very many loops in order to not accept them. I don't even know what they would have to do. I do know that groups that convert en masse, such as former evangelicals in the third world, for example, groups of formerly evangelical Filipinos or people in Latin America, you know, these are very famous cases of entire communities converting to Jewishness en masse and migrating together en masse to Israel. They have been accepted, and in fact, there's a whole stream of people working, especially the ultra right wing in Israel, working on these kinds of conversions because they use these communities to settle Palestinianly occupied lands in the West Bank. So there's a number of very interesting cases of Latin American communities that used to be evangelical, Christian, or Catholic, yeah, who decided to convert to Jewishness, applied through various settler NGOs to have rabbis sent to them, went through the process, converted en masse, and then came to Israel en masse and settled together as a community in the West Bank settlement. So the point of all of what I'm trying to say is that in Israel, access to residency, access to citizenship, like in most countries, is incredibly political. But in Israel, it's also attached to your ethnicity.
Do the Ethiopian Israeli Jews, have they been protesting against the plight of these African refugees as a form of kind of solidarity, Black Lives Matter, or are they sort of indifferent to it because, hey, if they're not if they're not Jewish, then they kind of don't extend that compassion to them?
Well, I can't speak on behalf of the Ethiopian Jews and who they feel compassionate with, but I will say that I haven't seen solidarity en masse between the Ethiopian Jews and the Eritrean and Sudanese Jews, non-Jews.
Yeah.
The Jews of African descent in Israel face, seemingly insurmountable racism, incredible police brutality, and have had several waves of mass protests that shut down the country over the last year and a half. So they have, a lot to struggle through themselves. And I think that everywhere in the world where you look, you find that when we start to see rights as a ladder rather than an anti-hierarchical pool of equality, then it's very easy to look at the people underneath you when you're already pretty low on the ladder and say, you are the source of my misery, rather than looking up the ladder. And I am certain that the waves of racist attacks that have started as a result of African asylum seekers coming to Israel have impacted the Black Jews significantly. And I'm sure that if you look closely at it, you will find several reports of Ethiopian Jews being mistaken for asylum seekers, because there's so many reports of even Yemenite Jews who are not Black being confused for non-Jews or for Palestinians. And that's the issue, is that when you have an ethnocracy, you build racism into the society, you build it into the institutions. And when you have an ethnocracy, you legitimize exclusion and inclusion based on what a person is born as. So in Israel, unlike in Europe, law is not territorialized. It is subjectified. So for example, if I go to Belgium, I can probably not legally buy a kilogram of marijuana. But if I go to Holland, maybe I can. In Israel, the law is not based on the place, it's based on you. So I, as an Israeli Jew, can go into various different parts of the land, and the law of Israeli Jews applies to me. A Palestinian who is a Gazan, who's stateless, who is technically under the government of Hamas, but is officially and in every way that matters under the control of the Israeli army and is a subject of the Israeli martial law, they can't go anywhere, but anywhere that they would go, they would be governed by that law. So that means that you are building into the system ways of excluding people and ways of legitimizing racism. And so when the government of Israel came out a couple of years ago with this Israel nation state law and said, officially, not only are we saying this is a Jewish state, but we are saying this is a Jewish only state. This state belongs to the Jewish people, regardless of where they live, meaning that a Palestinian who for 10 generations has been living in Haifa, this is not their state. A person born in New Jersey who's never even stepped foot in Israel but is Jewish has more rights than they do, right? That's what this nation state law means, which is an incredibly dangerous idea. And when the government endorses this thing, puts forward this thing and makes it into law, meanwhile, obviously through its own violent and exclusionary practices, usurps the land of non-Jews, excludes people from citizenship, encourages emigration out of anyone who's not Jewish, then at that point, can you really be surprised when you see street level racism against people who are not, of a particular group. So this is the kind of reality that is almost inevitable as a result of having an ethnocracy. And while theoretically speaking, the African refugees could find status in Israel if they were to convert, they would have to face all of the other levels of racism just by the fact of being Africans.
Wow. So is it right to describe? So is it right for some people to describe Israel then as an apartheid state that does need to be subjected to boycott, divestment, and sanctions, like the state of South Africa?
Well, some of the things I talked about touch on apartheid, but I would have to say that the apartheid as we know it, that started in South Africa officially as an Afrikaans word, it doesn't come from South Africa. Like these are imperial systems that you can trace back to Europe. You can trace clearly to the British Empire. Right now I'm in Canada, and here you have a system of apartheid because there's a law that applies to Canadian settlers and a different law called the Indian Act that applies to Native people that have been here for 15,000 years. And they do live apart mostly, not everywhere, but mostly. They are governed by a different law. And they do, by and large, have a very different experience of Canada. In South Africa, apartheid was much more militarized. And in fact, Canadian officials and South African officials, when those systems were being built, were in interaction with each other and were sharing knowledge. And likewise with Israel. And you can call Israel an apartheid state in the sense that there is a law that separates, that segregates between people. But I think a much more helpful analogy, and of course, all of these analogies are partial because Israel is not the same kind of apartheid as South Africa. What the founders of Israel want from the land and from Palestinians is different from what the Dutch and British wanted from the Africans in South Africa and from the land. It is a different place. It's going to take a different set of tactics, and it is going to take a different kind of frame to understand it. I do like the idea of ethnocracy because it is so encompassing. But the way I talk about Israel-Palestine more concretely is as a colonial, settler-colonial dynamic, because I feel that really is appropriate. The ultimate goal of colonialism is to extract for the benefit of a metropole. Israel doesn't have a home country the way that the settlers in South Africa did. Israel doesn't have a Britain or a Holland or Netherlands to go back to. We are in Israel because we have no other homeland, and that in that basic sense it is different. However, the practices that Israel's creation have been enacting on Palestinians, such as the mass ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, starting even before, but largely in 48 and continuing till today. Two-thirds of the Palestinian people have been expelled or denied return after they fled during war. So two-thirds of the Palestinian people are refugees stuck outside of the borders of their homeland. This is an Israeli policy, an Israeli practice, and is as a choice. Also, the constant mechanisms, both bureaucratic and military, of annexing more and more and more and more land. All of the processes that led to the creation of the state and to the establishment of this ethnocratic regime, these are colonial processes. But the difference between colonialism in general and settler colonialism in specific is that settler colonialism attempts to indigenize the settler, to eliminate the indigenous. And this is essentially where we are now, where Israel has become a settler colonial state. Its colonial project, which is a very overt colonial project in the West Bank, where you literally see colonies on top of a hill attempting to expel and take the land of the indigenous people in the bottom of the hill. Very, very overt, violent, and very clear colonial process, which is an extension of a process that is going on all over Israel. when you look at it as a settler colonial process, first of all, it becomes a lot clearer what we need to do to remedy the situation, how you reach the reconciliation and decolonization that is so necessary. It also means that there's a lot of hope for all of our people because, excuse me.
Bless you.
Thank you. Because so many states have partially, fully, in some way or shape or form decolonized. It's possible to live together in a non-colonial dynamic. It doesn't mean that one has to be removed for the benefit of the other, the way that a lot of people think about it. You know, people tend to think of Israel-Palestine as a soccer game. And so I'm a pro-Palestinian, I'm a pro-Israeli, and that's my position 1,000%, and this is my position 1,000%. And
Yeah.
every single thing that your government does is violent and horrible, and every single thing that my people do is good and holy. And that kind of simplistic soccer game analogy is not only fallacious, it's also, I find, detrimental to those of us who are trying to find, you know, a non-hierarchical way of living together, and the deconstruction of colonialism, not just in Israel-Palestine, but in its manifestations all over the world. You know, here in Canada, you could look around and you could almost not know that there is a colonial annexation happening every single day, that there are corporations that are usurping indigenous lands, and that there are, you know, dozens of communities that are in very active fights against the government for their rights, for their right to practice their way of life, for their right to their lands, for the right to hunt, for the right, you know, to continue what they were doing for thousands of years before we showed up here. So colonialism and settler colonialism in particular is alive and well in many places, not just in Israel. But in Israel seems to be getting a free pass in the international community, which brings me to the second half of your question in terms of boycott, divestment, and sanctions, which is, you know, I think the boycott, divestment, and sanctions call that was put out in 2005 by a large coalition of Palestinian civil rights groups, intended explicitly to draw connections between South Africa and Israel. I think that as a tactic, it's a great tactic. Why not? I mean, if you can pressure a country to abide by international human rights law and by basic agreements that its own leaders have signed up for through economic pressure, sure. If that works, great. Sometimes it has worked. There have been times when BDS movement was more successful, sometimes one less. It's an ongoing struggle. In South Africa, it took decades, and what the BDS movement was able to achieve in 15 years is absolutely mind-blowing. But I think it's not enough, because BDS is just economic pressure. It has to come with a second half. And we see now that accountability is being sought out in the International Criminal Court. Accountability was achieved in the International Court of Justice when it ruled against the segregation walls, annexation of land. And whether those processes will impact reality on the ground will depend on whether those institutions will translate these affirmations of the right of international law as supreme to racist law, whether they will be able to enact it and enforce it and actually create sanctions, not just consumer boycotts and various institutional divestments, but actual sanctions that would mean accountability. Because no state, Israel is just like any other state in a sense, no state is going to stop doing something that benefits its elites without pressure and accountability. It just doesn't make any sense. Just saying you should stop doing it because it benefits your elites and it's not moral, and wag my finger at you, that, like, no state functions like that. Not Belgium, not anywhere else, right? Belgian colonialism didn't end because the Belgians woke up one morning and said, oh shit, maybe colonialism is not so good for our general, you know, collective morality. There was processes, there was war, there was people fought with arms, and it makes a lot of sense why people fight for the defense of their homelands. Whether we can transition out of settler colonialism and the addiction that it supports for hierarchical racism, institutional racism, excuse me, whether we'll be able to transition out of it in a less violent way, than some of the other decolonization? That's the question. And the answer to that depends entirely, in my opinion, on the Israeli government, because it has had an opportunity every step of the way to change course. But you cannot expect people to negotiate in good faith when they have a gun to their head. And that's the situation that we're at now.
But what would you say? I'm going to try to be objective towards the Israeli state, because I mean I have friends from Israel who would probably be hardcore Likud supporters. What would you say to them when they say, we gave Gaza back to the Palestinians, and then in return they elected Hamas, who doesn't recognize the state of Israel and wants to wipe us out?
What do I say to that talking point?
Yeah. What would you say to that? What would you say to that talking point?
Yeah. I mean, it's a very common talking point that was articulated by Israeli government officials, and is very often re-articulated by various people that try to shut down discourse. And I would say that, I grew up in a settlement. I grew up very right-wing, and a lot of my community is still very resistant to acknowledging the fact that Palestinians exist, let alone the fact that they are human beings, let alone the fact that they have human rights. And that's another one of the chronic maladies of settler colonialism, is that it dehumanizes the settler. The colonized, and it erodes the moral integrity of the settler. Specifically to the specific talking point that you mentioned, there is a difference between correlation and causality. In 2005, the government of Ariel Sharon withdrew the 8,000 Israeli settlers that were living inside the Gaza Strip and largely moved them into the West Bank. So they continue to be settlers by and large. Many of them have experienced enormous economic impact as a result of being removed, even though Israel had thrown billions of dollars into the process. A big chunk of that money went into the actual removal of the settlers. But following the fact that they were removed and the Gaza Strip was no longer divided into four fingers, the 5 areas of the 4-finger plan that Ariel Sharon implemented in the Gaza Strip as a kind of divide and conquer. Gaza remains completely under the Israeli control. When a person is born, they get registered in the Israeli civil registry, not in every single thing that happens in the Gaza Strip happens with the approval of the Israeli government and is ruled by the Israeli government. So yes, you can argue that Israel withdrew from the West Bank, but Israel controls the territory, it controls the borders, it controls what gets imported, exported, it controls the waterways. It is constantly monitoring every single thing.
And the Palestinian Authority is more or less acting like a kind of a colonial viceroy to make sure that the population itself is kind of checked in line, right?
In the West Bank. In the Gaza Strip, I'm talking about the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip has been under closure since the 90s, has been under one form or another of closure since the 90s, since 2007, has been under complete siege. So you can say we removed the settlers, but you cannot say we disengaged, because disengaged means, to say we left means we left. It means we left and let those people have their own sovereignty and autonomy. We didn't do that. Where Palestinians can fish, Israel controls that. Whether they can control their airspace, Israel controls that. Whether they can leave their house, Israel controls that. Not to mention that periodically Israel bombs the Gaza Strip and carpet bombs the Gaza Strip and carpet bombs entire neighborhoods. So we left Gaza is not accurate. Secondly, they repaid us by electing Hamas is not a correct causality. Hamas was elected largely because of the corruption of the Fatah party that preceded them, and was in place since the beginning. Fatah party assumed that they were going to have eternal control, and as a result of that assumption, they allowed themselves to get incredibly corrupt and disconnected from the Gazan people. Hamas ran on a campaign of daycares and social services and reopening schools and doing all the things that every militant group that wants to become a civil government does, whether it's in Ireland or it's in South Africa with the ANC or it's in Palestine. And it makes sense why they won. They were an alternative. You know, they were the lesser of two evils. And when you talk to Gazans and you talk to the people who elected Hamas, it's not that they are Islamists particularly. It's not that they particularly care about having a government that is based on the religion of Islam, the way that Hamas claims to be, although there's a lot of debate about that as well. But they saw that as an alternative. And when they had those elections, which were monitored internationally, and the international consensus of European, North American, election monitors from all over the world was that election was a fair election, and it elected Hamas. The Americans and the Israelis funded and trained a coup led by the Fatah government party to try and topple the democratically elected Hamas, which of course only strengthened popular support for Hamas, because you try to make them into martyrs, you're only going to get more support. So the result of that civil war that was essentially fabricated out of nowhere was that Hamas maintained its power. It was elected in 2006, and it maintained its power after the Americans and Israelis tried to topple it. Why Hamas still has support after all these years, it's no mystery, right? Mm-hmm. So you can talk about that, but the way that the talking points, especially since so many of these come straight out of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, whose job it is to perpetuate a kind of argument abroad, a kind of dialogue-free set of points that are supposed to be indefensible, is that when you take them apart, they don't make any sense. Like, these talking points that I grew up with, that I believed in, once you actually start to learn the history, once you actually start to look at what's going on the ground, once you start to understand, just because two things happen at the same time does not mean that one is a cause of the other. Then these talking points, they fall apart. And at the end of the day, you have to ask yourself, what is my values? What is my morals? Do my values, if I put all these talking points aside for a second, do my values support that I am born and my neighbor are born in the same hospital, but we will never have equal rights? Is that something I can support? And if your answer is no, then you cannot possibly support the system. And you have to dedicate yourself to toppling the system and replacing it with a way that we can live together. And so many Israelis and Palestinians have put so much thought and so much building of relations in order to get there. We don't need to start from scratch. There's so much thinking about how to decolonize Israel-Palestine, how to open the borders, how to admit that we are in the Middle East. We are not in Europe. We are a Middle Eastern country. What that means is we need to learn Arabic. That means we need to learn our history. That means we need to acknowledge the Palestinian people have lived here for thousands of years. And they are part of our life, and they are part of our history. And what does that mean? Instead of trying to shove a fantasy into a reality that just does not work.
All righty. Well, Ms. Tarachansky, I know that you have to go now, right? All right. Well, thank you very much for your for the time you take. This conversation is going to be to be continued, because there are some other questions I want to get to, but we'll have to save it for another time, though.
Anytime.
So thank you for joining us, and I wish you the best of luck in your PhD, which I want to talk to you about next time. And anywho, thank you for joining us on 1+1.
Thank you, Youri.
Bye-bye.